everybody. We are super excited for our speaker tonight, to say the least, and I'll tell you about her in just a bit. Just a little bit of background about the event before I do that, though. This is the fourth event in the Irene Casteel Endowed Speaker Series, which this year is co-sponsored by Irene W. Casteel Endowed Fund, the Committee on Cultural and Special Events, the Department of Art and Communication, and Northern Review. The lecture series was created to bring to ONU speakers who examine a range of issues that impact society in meaningful ways. Currently, we aim to focus on experts in fields broadly related to human expression, culture, and the arts. The goal is to support the critical examination of culture and society with the purpose of identifying and emphasizing that which makes us human, an especially important concern in times of intense technological and social change. And to that end, we're extremely thrilled to have Dr. Sandra Coursey here, who will be presenting her project, Sleeping Beauties, Recovering Women's Voices at the Piano, which exists at the intersection of discussions about culture, history, gender, expression, and of course, music. Dr. Coursey, who resides in Bowling Green, Ohio, has a doctorate of musical arts from Bowling Green State University. As a doctoral student, she co-founded the chamber quintet Newphonia, which received an academic residency at the prestigious Interlochen Center for the Arts. Her dissertation, titled Portraits of a Wonderful Musician, exploring the intersection of graduate music student experiences and mental health through poetic inquiry, conducted interviews with students of graduate music programs. Dr. Coursey analyzed and organized the interview transcripts into poetic portraits representing the collective essence of the lived experiences of the interviewees. The set of 8 poems, Portraits of a Wonderful Musician, explores identity, self-perception, pressure, expectations, urgency, anxiety, the pursuit of perfection, guilt, depression, criticism, comparison, and burnout. And much of this knowledge is applied in the pursuit of student-centered learning and critical pedagogy. In Bowling Green, Dr. Coursey teaches piano, performs regularly, leads a music growth club for musicians of all levels, and is an active member of the BG arts community, helping make the town, I live there too, a great place to live. She's the founder of the Sleeping Beauties project, which we'll hear about tonight, and she's working on recording an album with that title as well. So I could go on, but I won't. Let's give a warm welcome to Dr. Sandy Coursey.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and I'm very happy to be here today sharing this research that I've been working on. It feels like a culmination of several years and really a lifetime of learning the piano to come to this moment, to this project that will hopefully have several iterations over the next few months and hopefully in the future as well. So today, like was introduced, I will be talking about works by women composers. These works specifically will be works from the late 19th century and early 20th century. And I titled this project Sleeping Beauties for several reasons. One of them being that in the scientific article community, whenever you do research, when your research is not necessarily recognized or acknowledged for years on end, and then later on comes to be understood as being important to the community and important as a contribution to research, then they often title those scientific articles Sleeping Beauties. And I see this music by women as having a similar effect in having been unacknowledged for several decades, sometimes more than a century. And so today I hope that I will give you just a brief introduction into some of the works by women composers of this time period. And I chose to do this project because, well, there's several problems here in the Western classical canon. And one of them is that music by women has always existed, but is heavily underrepresented and often totally excluded from the Western classical canon. And although women have always composed, history has almost always failed to write them into the story, and has also failed to totally document their music and their legacies. So although it's very difficult to find their music, it's not widely known and it's not widely shared, it does exist. And so today this presentation is here to show you just a snapshot of some of the music by women that exists historically. This picture here is just a picture that I think represents the project in a sense that these women, Victorian for the most part, performing their music that they composed while they're being a bit resurrected today, having come back from years in the past not being performed for a long time. So the purpose of this project is to research specifically historical piano music by women and to focus specifically on rarely performed works. There are composers that are women from history that have gotten a bit more traction lately. Some of their works have gotten more traction. So for this project, I wanted to focus specifically on works that have not been performed or recorded as much. And to also include specifically women composers of diverse heritage and nationality. So you will get a sampling of women from several different countries. This will exist within the Western classical canon though, so you won't get any music necessarily by women of East Asian descent or African descent, but you will get a good sampling of music by women from the classical canon. And then beyond that, I wanted to make sure that I researched their full catalog of works, all of their compositions, their lives, their legacies, and to disseminate these findings. That's the most important thing. And I do that by learning and performing and also recording these works, and to then, of course, make these recordings accessible to the public. It's not super helpful to get a recording by a prestigious record label and then have a CD that is only available to purchase online somewhere, you know. So I want these recordings to be accessible on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Music, all that good stuff. So easy enough to listen to, just like Bach or Beethoven. So there are some scopes and some limitations to this research. Specifically, I really wanted this music to be music that was in the public domain and generally easier for people to find. So this work will all be in the public domain, will be solo piano works written within the Romantic period, approximately 1800 to 1910, mostly in the latter half of the 19th century. And again, all these scores, for the most part, besides one, are available on imslp.org if you're not familiar with it. It's a fantastic music score resource called the International Music Score Library Project. You can get all types of public domain works for free there, but it's not easy to find works by women unless you go really searching for it. So there's a lot of digging that needs to be done, even in these resources here. And then beyond that, there's very limited biographical information on several of these women composers. So I work with what I have and piece together things through different resources. And then, again, this is really only just a sampling of music by women, so this is just, you're really getting the representative works of a longer solo recital program, so you'll get a few of those that fit within a larger 60 to 75 minute recital program. So my methodology here, it includes taking a hauntological lens, a look at things in the sense that, well, if you're not familiar with hauntology, really what you need to know is that it's the idea that things from the past affect the future and affect the present, whether we realize it or not. And beyond that, it's about not necessarily just our present being affected by the past, but by acknowledging the lost possible futures that we cannot have due to what we have experienced in the past. And beyond that, I've taken a phenomenological look at these pieces in the sense that I'm foregrounding the subjective lived experiences of these women composers, but also my own subjective lived experience as a woman pianist who has been playing piano for my entire life. I remember very vividly the first few years I started taking piano lessons. And I started at 7. And when I finished my method books, I remember graduating to the real composers. And those were Beethoven and Bach and Mozart. And once I was introduced to those three, I remember specifically asking my teacher, why are all of these composers men? And she said to me, those are just the people who wrote music. And so in my 7-year-old mind, I thought to myself, well, I guess that means that I don't write music. And that is, again, an example of a lost future, of something that could have been, but is not because of past issues that have not yet fully been resolved. So beyond that, my methods include digital archival research through IMSLP, like I said, the Library of Congress, and Ancestry. Ancestry has a lot of really good primary resources, if you can find them. And then also biographical research. I contacted several historians, specifically a very nice man named Ragtime Bill. He was very helpful. And like I said, several primary and secondary resources, you'll see a few. And then beyond that, going back to the phenomenology of things, my embodied research, which includes practicing the music, performing the music, and recording it. So this project is important because, well, historiography, which is the way history gets written, influences the present perspectives of things and the future developments of that history and what gets written again. It also fills gaps in the existing understanding of music by women, their music as messaging, which we will talk about more today, and what sociocultural influences have been at play in deciding what music gets remembered and what doesn't. And then beyond that, excluding musicians, excluding marginalized communities perpetuates exclusion. So if you continue to exclude a certain set of people from art, then they will perpetually be excluded. And then including them, even just once, gives the opportunity for change and possibility. So that's what we're doing today. And I want you to keep this in mind throughout the entire presentation today, that the music here that you are hearing is the message that these women are trying to communicate. They didn't necessarily have a voice in the same sense that men in their time did, and so the way that they communicated was through music and not necessarily through clear verbal ideas. So you'll see that in all of this music today, that the music here is the message. It's not written out clearly and cleanly for you, but you will see the status and lived experience of these women through what they write in their music. And that takes me to the status of these women composers. One of the most important things to consider as you listen to this music is that the women in the late 19th century and early 20th century and before that were very much confined to the domestic sphere of music making and art making in general, which means that they really were not allowed to make music publicly. It usually happened in their homes. And because of that, they were often called amateurs. The term amateur comes from the Latin root amateur, which just means lover of. This word did not necessarily always have a negative connotation, but developed one over time, and now often implies an inferiority to professionals. And since women were confined to the domestic sphere of music making, their music was often dismissed as light or pedagogical, which means like teaching music, as opposed to what men were allowed to compose, which was professional music. And professional just comes from the Latin root profiteri, which means to declare openly or publicly. And if you are confined to the domestic sphere, then you are not able or allowed or meant to be declaring something publicly. So this was professional, a label that was often reserved for men, and often meant it evolves now to mean skilled paid work, as opposed to the amateur. So beyond that, just being called amateur was not enough, but to make sure that women composers did not leave the domestic sphere, to make sure that they did not push themselves to possibly meet what men could do at the piano, well, we have a piano plague, the Klavierzeug. So women in the Victorian era were told that if they played piano too much, if they exerted too much energy, then they might come down with something called the piano plague, which here are some of the symptoms of what they might suffer if they played piano too much. I don't know, I've never gotten a nosebleed from playing piano, and I've practiced for a long time at times. So this is, a scare tactic. It keeps women in their place. And you will see that not all the women that we learned about today took this seriously. So that takes me to one of the first spaces in which music making was happening at this time. And American parlors was one of the big ones. And a parlor in this time in America is a formal living room, and at this time, these were living rooms that most middle-class families had and used for community gatherings of families, neighbors, and women were the ones who were expected to make music in these gatherings. And if a woman was making music in these gatherings, it was a sign of social and cultural refinement, not just for the woman herself, but also for the family that she was coming from. And so it was her job to entertain the guests of the household. And because of this, it became more popular for people in middle-class families to hold gatherings and write music specifically for these types of events. So the first couple of pieces you'll hear today will be pieces that are specifically for a parlor type of space. And that takes me to my first composer, Estelle Ricketts. So Estelle Ricketts, she was born in 1871, and unfortunately, out of all the composers we will talk about today, there is the least information available on her, and that is one because, well, her father was an emancipated slave, and she really was not written into history at all. She was only able to write piano music because her father was literate, and that is the only reason he was freed as a slave in the first place. He actually was freed and then taken back into slavery and was only able to reclaim his freedom because of his literacy. He wrote a note to a friend in another state who came and got him. And that is how he made his family and had Estelle Ricketts, who eventually made it into the middle class enough to have a piano and learn to play it as well as write her own music. So this is the piece that you will hear by her, Rippling Spring Waltz, is the earliest known published piece by a Black woman in 1893. Of course, music by Black women existed before this, but this is the first documented published case that we can see. And beyond that, very little research has been done on her life. There's really not any other compositions that we can find by her. But I was able to find in a directory one instance of her in Derby presenting herself publicly as a musician in a directory. And like we were talking about earlier, the idea of the amateur versus the professional, Estelle here is professing herself publicly as a musician already in 1893. Even though she is being confined to an amateur sphere, she is pushing against it by professing her musicianhood publicly as a professional. And I will say that after she got married later on in her life, she did not present herself as a musician publicly anymore, and you will find that that is, it is a trend among women composers. So before I go on to the next slide, I'll play for you Rippling Spring Waltz. So that is Estelle Riggett's Rippling Spring Waltz, and it is really in a clear salon style. It's very light and bouncy. It's for dancing, but writing something like this for Estelle was very much a way of communicating her status to the people around her. It was a way of communicating what she believed to be her abilities in a world that believed she might not be able to do that. And so writing this and publishing it in this time was a way for Estelle to show that she belonged in the middle class, she belonged in the public eye, and she belonged in classical music writing in a world that believed she shouldn't even be literate. So one other American composer that I want to talk about today is Charlotte Blake, and amazingly she was born here in Ohio in Franklin County, and she was also a parlor composer for the most part. She worked with Jerome H. Remick, and they had publishing companies both in New York City and Detroit. She eventually moved to Detroit and worked as a secretary for them for a while before she became a composer with them. Early on in her compositional career, she signed her works only as C. Blake, a non-gendered way to sign your work. But eventually she did write Charlotte Blake fully on her published works. Her catalog includes a lot of rags, a lot of dances, and voice with piano pieces. But where her life gets really interesting is that she was married very briefly in New York and divorced before she moved to Los Angeles and appears on a census with another fellow divorcee, Catherine Engel, who she is marked as her partner in the census. Catherine Engel is marked as the head of the household. Beyond that, when she was younger, she also was marked in the census as a music composer professionally. So she was not, again, I think this happened before her marriage, that she was able to professionally represent herself as a musician, but then after the marriage and divorce, she stopped publicly representing herself as a composer in that same way. But today I will be playing a piece by her that I think represents maybe some of the experiences or her perspective on her marriage. But she actually did experience some fame in her lifetime, but not without backhanded compliments, as women composers typically get. When they do get a compliment, it's not always just a compliment. So this is an example of something that was written about her in 1907. Woman has invaded another field in which man thought he was supreme. She has become a writer of popular songs and instrumental numbers, and many of the most tuneful and affecting ditties of the day are written by women. Miss Charlotte Blake has established a reputation that most any of the men songwriters might envy. She is unquestionably the most prolific and versatile of the many women composers. So she's invading a man's space, which you will see a lot of in this presentation. So what I will be playing by her today is called the Bridal Veil Waltzes. It's plural, but it's really just one waltz with several sections in it. And this is another lighter parlor style waltz. But I will say that this piece was written by her about 3 years before her marriage and subsequent divorce in New York. So it could possibly give some idea into her perspective on marriage at the time. I want you to listen as I play this to the different characters of the sections of this piece, and imagine how you think it might relate to a marriage. It's not all happy, that's all I can tell you. So this is Bridal Veil Waltzes by Charlotte Blake. there's several sections in there that are marked, the musical marking Dolorosa, which is sorrowful. And I think there's several sections in here that don't necessarily sound like a happy wedding day, so it makes you wonder what's going on in her mind a few years before her marriage. So just for time, I'd love to continue on, and we're out of America now and moving on to the music of the European salons. And this was a bit of a different space, but also a similar space in a lot of ways. Just like an American parlor, a salon was a domestic place to hold gatherings for playing music, sharing art. But European salons were not for the middle class. They were for aristocracy. They were for the upper class. They were cultural and political gatherings meant for influence. And these happened typically in the musical hubs of Paris, Vienna, and Berlin. Women, again, in Europe were confined to the salon sphere for the most part, and salon music became a label to discredit women and their works when they started writing salon music. Composers, if you've heard of some of the most famous composers of romantic music, Chopin and Liszt, also often wrote salon music, but their work is typically not denigrated in the same way. They also wrote music for the concert hall. So women who were writing music only for the salon sphere were often considered amateur in a similar way to the American parlor scene. And this is a picture, by the way, of Franz Liszt playing in a salon there. So our first European salon composer that we'll talk about today is Mélanie Boni, and she was born in France, but she was originally born to a lower middle class family. She married into aristocracy later on. Her life story is very interesting because she taught herself piano until her parents decided to send her to the Paris Conservatory, which is one of the biggest places in Europe to go and study piano. But unfortunately, or fortunately, however you see it, when she was at the Paris Conservatory, she met a man, and that man was also a musician. She fell in love, and her parents did not approve. And so they pulled her out of the conservatory and arranged a marriage with a man decades older than her. So unfortunately, she had to marry someone else, and this person that she was arranged to marry was not supportive of her musical endeavors. So you can see in her catalog there is a large hiatus in her work, several years where she wasn't writing at all. But then she reconnected with that man that she met at the Paris Conservatory, and he encouraged her to start writing again. He introduced her to a music publisher, and she started writing in secret. And she often wrote under the name Mel Boni. It is less gendered than Melanie, so you can't quite tell who's writing it. But when she started writing music again, her output increased just double overnight. She has over 300 works cataloged now, and what I'll play for you today is one of the first works that she wrote after her hiatus. So this will be you'll hear that this piece was written in a time of great inspiration for her. And it's also written in a salon style that has a bit more of a French flair to it. She went to school with composers like Debussy, so you'll hear that typical French harmonic style. But this piece specifically was written soon after her affair began. And of much of her music, famous composer Camille Saint-Saëns said, "I never imagined a woman could write such music." Another backhanded compliment of sorts. So this is Thoughts of Autumn. I thought it would be especially appropriate for today. This is another salon piece. And this will be the last of the salon-only pieces that I will play today. And Melanie never really performed publicly, so this again would have been a piece that would have been played for a more intimate audience and in a Paris salon, most likely. Really salon-only, salon-centric, parlor-centric music that I will be playing today. I have two other pieces to play for you next, but I wanted to point out that although all of this parlor and salon music is written in a bit of a lighter style, there are elements of bravura in all of them. And so while these women were writing in a style that they were confined to, they did find ways to show their ability to do more and show that there was skill, there was understanding there, even whenever they were confined to a specific style. And so now these next two women, the final two women I will talk about, you will see were women who broke out of these stylistic confines a little bit more. The first one being, well, before I talk about her, I should talk about why and the space that required it. And that is because not all music is made domestically. Some of it is made in the concert hall. And you know, most of the music in classical world that we're familiar with was made for the concert hall. And that's because, well, piano recitals have been around from the mid-19th century, thanks to Liszt, who created the piano recital as we know it today. And recital just comes from the Latin root recitare, which means to recite, and again, to share publicly. So if you think back to the idea of the professional, there's something about the idea of sharing publicly that does make you a professional in the public eye, right? So when you're performing publicly, it puts you on a different plane of perspective. And typically when you're playing in the concert hall, there's an expectation of spectacle, a little bit more of an expectation of technical mastery, technical dazzle, you know. And Liszt was one of the composers who really popularized this idea. And when he played recitals, he kind of gained a celebrity status and helped kind of push forward this popularity of the idea of the virtuoso, which you will see has an interesting definition. One, its Latin root, virtue, which means not just goodness, but manliness and courage. So just the idea of being a virtuoso is inherently gendered in some way. But beyond that, a virtuoso is a performer who plays with serious technical dazzle, mastery. It's supposed to be impressive. It's not just about how it sounds, but also what it looks like and how it appears. And so you will see that with these two other composers that I was talking about, their music is not just about what it sounds like, but how it looks whenever you play it, and how it feels whenever you experience it live in concert. So the first of these is Teresa Carreño, and she is a Venezuelan-born pianist, child prodigy, who moved to New York City at a very young age to start her performance career, and then eventually performed a lot in Paris as well. So she was an international performer from a very young age. You can see that that first picture is of her as a child prodigy. And she performed into her adult years, so she was always a performer. In fact, I don't have anything about her marriages here, but she actually had 4 marriages, 3 of which were more supportive of her career, 1 of which was not. But several of her marriages she had really helped her book her performances and stuff. So she kind of used her marriages more as a way to further her performance career, which is something that we haven't seen in some of the other composers so far. She was also often called the Valkyrie of the piano because she had a lot of strength, sheer strength in her performance, and so you'll see that in a lot of the descriptions of her, they like to mention her masculine vigor. So again, to show people that you can play with virtuosity, for these women, it required setting aside some of their femininity and performing a level of masculinity that was expected out of concert performers. So what I will play for you today by Teresa Carreño is actually one of her earlier works. She wrote this when she was 15, so she was very young whenever she wrote this. And this piece is a bit of a crossover between a salon and a concert style, because you can see in the title, it's from a set called 3 Short Pieces for the Salon, but it's also an etude meditation. And etudes are typically more technically demanding, and her being a virtuoso performer, this would have been a piece that she would have played in concert. So although it's inspired by the salon style, it has a bit more of that concert showiness that you'll see. So this is called Un rêve en mer, which is a dream at sea, by Teresa Carreño. this piece is that with combining the style of salon music with a more concert performance approach, Teresa Carreño sang a lot. One of them being that she belonged in both places, just like Liszt and Chopin. And I also forgot to mention that this piece does have a dedication on it to Monsieur Marmontel. He was one of the most renowned Paris Conservatory professors at the time. Teresa Carreño actually did not go to school for piano, and she never did, but she probably did interact with him during her time in Paris. So to have dedicated this piece to a very well-known Paris Conservatory professor at the age of 15 is a pretty bold move. I will say that. So speaking of bold, is our last composer to talk about today, a German composer named Adele Osterö. And she was actually very, very famous here in America. She traveled to America several times. She took a train all over America. She basically lived on a train for most of her life, and she was an esteemed student of Franz Liszt, actually one of his favorite students, by his accounts, not mine, by his. And she was also a child prodigy, just like Teresa Carreño. And just to kind of, compare the two, at least in the sense that they were both considered publicly as virtuosas, they were also both child prodigies. And if you remember, the idea of performing in concert halls and being a virtuosa has to do with spectacle. And so a child prodigy does have some spectacle in it, and that's how they kind of break out of that salon sphere and are able to perform in a more public way. She was also great friends and collaborators with Tchaikovsky, the composer of the Nutcracker Suite, and also the composer of the Sleeping Beauty Waltz. So that's also another reason why I decided to name this project what I did. She, like I said, was very popular with the US audiences, and she actually performed at the opening of Carnegie Hall with Tchaikovsky under his baton. She has a smaller catalog of works, and some of those works are lost. You can't find them, especially she's rumored to have written a full piano concerto with orchestra. That score is nowhere to be found. You can't find it anywhere. But she has a huge catalog of works, and she was very well known for, like Teresa Carreño, playing very physically demanding repertoire, very mentally demanding repertoire. She knew more music by memory than like anyone at the time. And beyond that, she performed not only the popular piano works of the time in concerts, such as the music by Liszt, her teacher, but also she programmed her own works, which was very unusual for most performers of the time to have programmed their own works, let alone a woman performing her own works to perform alongside Liszt's. So that's a huge, it's a huge way to say my work belongs on the same plane as his, and you don't need any words to say it, you just do it. So she never married, and unfortunately her performance career stopped whenever her sister died. Her sister was she was essentially her performance manager and traveled everywhere that she went, booked her performances, all of that. And so when her sister died, she went back to Berlin and stopped publicly performing. She continued to teach, but she eventually lost her whole family and never married, and continued only to dedicate her life to music. She has this beautiful quote that, "Now I'm quite alone, but I have my art." And that is how she treated piano for her whole life, was kind of her company. So today, this is the last piece I will be performing for you, and it is an etude de concert. And this is a style of piece that Liszt was very well known for performing, a concert etude, a very technically demanding piece of work that is for the concert hall. And this specific concert etude, to my knowledge, has not been recorded, if performed really in a documented way at all, since Adele herself performed it. She has some other pieces that have recently been performed and recorded a little bit more, but from easily accessible recordings, you can't really find anything on this piece at all. So I think that if you're familiar with Liszt's writing style at all, you will see some of his influence come through this piece. Again, think about the idea of spectacle, the way that it looks, as well as the way that it sounds. And the idea that she was not only asserting her competence as a performer and a composer, but also, again, setting aside some of her femininity to assert masculinity for spectacle and to prove her worth as a performer here. So this is the Etude de Concert by Adele Osterho. really love about, especially both Teresa Carreño and Adele's writing, is that although it is more of a virtuosic style of writing, I feel that neither of these pieces ever lose their salon quality. I think that they all have that specific influence that I think is not lost, and I think that there's something really beautiful about that. So in conclusion, from all the music that we've heard today, I think the biggest message, the biggest idea, if you take away anything here, is that music is messaging. Music itself is messaging, and that writing music is a way to assert your freedom. It's a way to assert your equality, a way to assert your status, and a way to assert your professionalism. And beyond that, when you are faced with constraints, sending a message within those constraints is, it takes both conforming and subverting those constraints to send a message. And I think that all of the women we've talked about today have really good examples of both fitting within constraints, conforming within constraints to send a message, but then also subverting expectations to send a separate message. And so when you combine those two things, then you get a full story. And beyond that, we've learned today that past issues, resolved or not, haunt current dynamics. And that any act of resistance, however old it is, it can outlive its creator. And so this is music that is over 100 years old, but is music that now I think is very relevant. And it's relevant in the sense that if we don't acknowledge it now, then we may never have music by women composers or marginalized communities of any sort in the same level that we have music by men right now. And so now is as good a time as any to acknowledge this issue and to move forward, and to remember that history tries to decide who is valued both through inclusion, exclusion, and through labels. And you know, these ideas are things that we learn in school, or things that we learn in music history. And you know, a lot of it is true, but a lot of it is left out, and a lot of it leaves a lot to be assumed. And so the only thing that we can do to counteract it is to follow up with our own research, to be skeptical, and to you know, constantly be advocating for what music you find to be interesting. It wasn't until I started learning music by women composers that I started realizing, oh, this is what's been missing from all the piano music I've learned for the past 20 years of my life. So it's never too late to do your own additional research, and you'll never know what you find out until you do. So these are just some of my main resources here, and I wanted to say thank you for listening to this presentation, but also invite questions if you have any. So thanks so much for listening. Yes.
My name is Megan Wood. I'm one of the professors in the Art and Communications department, and I have a number of my students here that are in gender communication and culture. One of the things that we talked about in class is the hidden curriculum, and it strikes me that your presentation addresses at least two dimensions of that, both in terms of what these composers had to learn in their time in order to do that subversion and conformity bit, but then also your story about being young and sort of having that absence of women composers and how that impacted your own perception of yourself as a musician. And I wonder how you see, I know you use hauntology as a frame, but do you see your project as part of the disruption of a hidden curriculum in that way?
Yes, I do, and I hope it's just the beginning. You know, there's a lot of current research happening on women composers, especially women composers from the 20th century and beyond, because the closer we get to now, the easier it is to find out about them. And so what I wanted to do with this research was to kind of bring back the stories that were a little bit older. And there are, again, composers who are even from further back in history that we didn't get to talk about today. But I do see this work as being just a part of it. It's really, I hate to say it, but no, I don't. It's as much for me as it is for everyone else. Because, again, being a pianist that, got my doctorate in it, it wasn't until probably my doctorate degree that I played anything by a woman composer. And so, that's a long time of studying music by men, for a career. And so when I graduated, I decided, it's time to make my own curriculum and learn some things that I didn't get to learn, throughout school. And so I feel like I'm kind of reteaching myself piano in a way through learning these pieces, stuff that I should have encountered and never did. Yeah, any other questions? Yeah, of course.
Hi, my name is Emily. I'm also in art and communication, and a lot of my personal research is into sort of embodied research, trying to understand the lives of women in Italy. And so I really appreciate this research. I think it's really important. So I have sort of one comment and then a question. The first is, I'll start with a question, which is, I'm really curious to hear a little bit more about your own sort of embodied experience of playing this music and how you feel like, do you feel like you are in a dialogue? I think, as creative people, we always kind of assume we're in a dialogue with people that have come before us, and I'm curious about your feelings as an educator, as a creator, as a woman, like how it feels to be in a dialogue with these particular women.
Yes, that's a great question. And I think again, this is something that I didn't even realize was missing from my study until I encountered it. Because I think, as women, this is something that we, people, again, like marginalized communities of all sorts, live with the idea of having to suspend your own perspective to make it through the world that is made for men. So anytime you're learning music that is written by a male composer, you're in some ways suspending your own experience to put yourself in theirs instead. Especially in the Western classical canon, this is very much true, because in the Western classical canon, you are really expected to perform the music exactly as it is written on the page. You're not really supposed to put in your own stuff. You're really supposed to do it just how Beethoven did it, and if you don't, then it's not quite as valuable in many people's eyes. So when I started learning music by women composers, I realized all of a sudden I didn't have to do that extra layer of suspending my own experience, and instead playing music that related to my own experience. And so the best way that I can describe it is that a lot of times when I'm working through this music, even just sight reading it, whether I end up learning it fully or not, it feels like I'm reading, a page out of their diaries in a way, because I can see, one, their knowledge of classical tradition, their knowledge of it, their study of it, but then I can also see their subversion of it, and a lot of times you can see those things in real time, thinking, oh wow, like she really knew what she was doing here, but then why'd you do it like that? Is there some sort of message there? There's a lot of decoding that you can do, and it's something that I really enjoy, and like not having to suspend my perspective in that same way. Yeah, thanks for that question.
I also just want to say, your research is really making me think of the women photographs from the Romantic Victorian era photographers who are functioning in this sort of amateur universe, and today are slowly being uncovered. I can't help but think of someone like Julia Margaret Cameron. I don't know if you know who she is. I think you would just enjoy looking into her work and her life, because she was like, she couldn't make photos until her children were grown. and she just did it in her home, but her work is like now celebrated as some of the most important and interesting. It's a Sleeping Beauty early photography work, and it's so like visceral and physical. I was listening to a lot of this music, and I was like, oh my gosh, Julia Margaret Cameron must have like listened to this and been like, thinking about this, and
Absolutely, yeah, and a lot of that music is music of experience, music of being in a place, in a time, and so I can totally see that, listening to that, and doing your art in a parlor or something, totally. Yeah, any other questions from anyone? Thanks so much.